All right, Dr. Tatiana Stray here, and I want to talk about the role of anger in negotiations. In an earlier upload, I was talking about the role of emotion, so if you haven't watched that, please do. Because I think it's really important to understand that emotions are an inherent part of the social experience. They're a way that people communicate with each other about their preferences, the likes, the dislikes, where they stand on an issue, where the relationship stands. There's a lot of important information that happens in a relationship, in a negotiation exchange. Now, anger is a little bit different than most other negative emotions. I would say out of a lot of them, it's kind of a healthy negative emotion. But there's a little bit of a fear because I think anger often gets grouped with these other negative emotions such as hostility, belligerence, contempt, criticism. And so people feel like anger isn't necessarily a good one, but let's chat a little bit about the research around it. So first of all, emotions are a way that we learn about people's limits, their preferences, about how they feel about something, and it indicates how cooperative or uncooperative an individual is based on the overall expression in an interaction. And anger specifically is really about saying, you've violated a boundary. It could be in terms of boundary related around respect, autonomy. It's really when someone has crossed a line with you. And so the expression of anger is really the reestablishment of that boundary and kind of the preference. And when we think about how science looks at it, some ways that we would code anger would be things like frustrations, angry I statements, angry questions, and commands. So there are verbal components to anger and also body expressions. I want to distinguish a little bit about anger and some other emotions just so that we can really cleanly separate and then learn how to use it a little bit strategically in our negotiations. So let's talk about a pretty common one, which is defensiveness. Defensiveness is about deflecting responsibility. And in behavioral cues, it would come out as yes, but, cross-complaining, minimizing, making excuses, aggressive defenses, such as saying, I did not. So as you see, defensiveness is like distancing from responsibility and not being willing to engage in something. Very different than you've crossed a boundary. Let's take a look at another one. Sometimes you'll get things like belligerence, which is trying to get a rise out of the person through some sort of angry provocations. And that might look like taunting questions, non-reciprocal humors, interpersonal terrorism, which would be asking questions like, what would you do if I leave or if I refuse to pay? And here you're actually very much disrespecting the person. Like you've crossed the line into disrespecting the person to the point where you want them now to be a bit unhinged. Another kind of common one you might see is domineering. So someone trying to enforce control and impose compliance. And that might be through invalidating statements, someone lecturing and patronizing. So going on and on about a topic and not letting you speak. Giving you a question with a predetermined answer, and just like incessant speaking about their point. Now, here again, it kind of looks like anger in that it wants you to do something, but the big difference is that in domineering behavior, they're trying to impose a behavior on you versus anger, you violated some sort of boundary or personal space. So anger is really healthy in relationships, especially when expressed in terms of very clear communication in terms of what you need, what the boundary looks like. But all these other shades of negative expressions, whether it's belligerence, defensiveness, domineering, or other ones like criticism and contempt, you're going into now different shades of ruining the relationship and disrespecting the person. So anger is not about that. Anger is very much a healthy relational behavior. So I've given you a bit of the flavor, and let's chat about how it kind of plays out in negotiations. So earlier I said emotions are very important when there's trust in a relationship, when there's cooperation, when the emotions that are expressed are authentic. And so anger plays in all of these, right? When we care about the person when we expect them to be giving us authentic information, then when they express some anger, it's actually really helpful for us to know kind of like what are we navigating? Is there room for actually moving in a negotiation or not? Or did we, press a button where maybe we shouldn't? The other interesting component, again, is that power dynamic. So when you're in a low power position, you're more likely to be influenced by the anger of the high power person. And so even if the person didn't necessarily do a very angry response, your physiology, your perception will disproportionately kind of allow you to think that like it means more than it does, because evolutionary, we were very much conditioned to look to leadership to get our rewards and incentives in the group. And so when it comes to anger, it has a disproportionate effect if you're in the low power position. But if you're in the high power position, you're likely to be insensitive to the anger of those below you. And this can also be negative because you might be missing really valuable information that your employees are trying to convey to you. So there are all these different aspects kind of happening. So let's talk about like the actual role of anger in negotiations. So I would definitely say anger is like a double-edged sword, and it's something to be navigated with balance. First of all, it's informational. So in negotiations, display of anger is a guidepost for limits. It can suggest competitive behavior if done excessively. And savvy negotiators will use this information to kind of move accordingly. Generally, you should be angry about the things you care the most about. They did studies where they found that like when people express too much anger on low priority issues and on high priority issues, like on everything, people just kind of decide you're kind of an irrational person and don't pay attention to your anger cues at all. But if you use it very sparingly and specifically on the things that you care about most, you're going to get the most movement on those issues. So it's very, very helpful as a strategy. Anger can be really important in terms of building reputation. So again, if you have kind of a level-headed reputation and you use anger very sparingly, it kind of can give you the perception that you're tough but fair. But if you're angry too much, it starts ruining your relationships. And while anger will allow you to maximize one negotiation, in the future, people won't actually want to work with you again. So you have to know that, yeah, you can use it very effectively in one negotiation, but you will also ruin the relationship in the future if you use it too much. The third component, which is kind of interesting, so let's say we've expressed a little too much anger and we've gone over the edge and we recognize that actually it's having a bad impact on our relationship. Well, the research also suggests that an apology following a display of anger changes things. In that regard, the negotiator is seen as more competitive. But so it improves the relationship, but it could lead to fewer concessions in the future. So there's definitely this like this balance you have to play of knowing when to be angry and for what issues and how it impacts your relationship. So you want to be tough but fair, but you also want to be seen as cooperative. So you have to use anger sparingly. You can use apologies to buffer if your display of anger went a little too far, but you never want to do it so much that people think, they're going to get what you want, and or like you're just a person that's angry all the time and therefore they just ignore you. It's not just anger that's really important in terms of negotiations. There's research on how disappointment, worrying, expressions of expressions of like regret actually lead to concessions. But in all that research on negative emotions, there's a general trend that a little bit is okay. You'll actually get the concession, but too much will backfire because people won't want to negotiate with you. People do not want to have business relationships, with people that are constantly expressing worry, disappointment, regret. Like it gets a little bit too much. And one of the research I think that's very complementary to this space is the idea of what is the collective expression of negotiations in emotions. And I did some of that research and I find it interesting. And the general takeaway is, positive emotions are really important to start building trust, to build those dynamics. They create a bit of a buffer for when negative emotions do come up, because they're going to, and that's important. And the important thing to note is generally there should be more positive than negative expressions in a negotiation and in your professional relationships. And outside of the negotiation, always be buffering with positive emotions. Allow yourself to have the freedom to be assertive when you need to, but be aware that negotiations happen within the context of relationships. And so it's up to you to really buffer and manage that so that you can strategically be angry about the things you care about. So I'll definitely explore, I think, anger in the future. I think it's a really interesting and important emotion, because I think it also speaks to our comfort in asserting our needs and that willingness to be angry in a relationship in a way that's productive, not destructive. I would never advocate for that. But I hope that in you thinking about the role of anger in your negotiations, you think about how you are currently using it, whether or not you're being strategic about it, and how you might allow yourself to be a little bit more genuine about moments where someone is asking for too much or someone has crossed a boundary. And so anger is a healthy way to reassert your boundary. And a quick tip: if you express anger and someone doesn't actually respond to you in a way that you would expect in a healthy relationship, that's actually a really important piece of information in that relationship, that they don't really care about you. They're not in a cooperative stance. There isn't a level of trust and relationship building that's both ways. So all these emotional nuances and exchanges that happen in a negotiation are pieces of very important information about what's happening in the relationship and the health of it. So that's a little bit about that, and I'd love to hear what you guys think.